Hello, Internet. My name is Chamomile.
And I'm Requiem. So, you beat the boss,
Yeah,
so the invocation worked.
maybe, but we don't know that for sure. It could just be a coincidence.
Did any hag show up?
I mean, we don't know for sure that she was a hag. Lots of people could be named Mother Hunger. I'm sure it's a very common name here.
It's a very common hag name here. I think there was something you were going to talk about.
Yeah, as we are crawling about in a giant upside down desecrated bell, do you want to
Oh,
talk
that's what
about?
we're in?
Yeah, there's actually a gigantic bell upside down. It's called Hondo. Yeah, do you want to talk about the Satanic Panic? I do believe you have been
Let
doing
me get
some
out my
reading on the
notes,
subject.
actually.
Huh?
Hold on. Let me get out my notes,
Ah, fantastic.
which are actually a little incomplete.
I
uh,
mean,
so,
you have a master's degree, and you have turned that research capability towards a Let's Play podcast where we're playing, a grimdark to the point of silliness video indie game from 2019. I think even if your notes are a little incomplete, you are still like monstrously overprepared.
uh, yeah, we talked to outside about, since this is very like dark sort of quasi-religious imagery, this is the sort of thing that would have had the media up in arms like 10, 20 years ago. Like now it comes out and nobody cares. There was a time like there would have been a media firestorm all over this. Like Mass Effect had a media firestorm, and I mentioned Mass Effect because we considered playing Mass Effect as our Dragon Age replacement before going with Blasphemous. Mass Effect had one of these weird moral panics about it. I don't know if it was Jack Thompson who instigated it or if it was something else. Jack Thompson being the infamous anti-video
Right.
game lawyer. But there was the claim that Mass Effect had like pornographic simulations of sex instead of like barely soft core.
Right. There was like some side boob and then a fade to black.
Yeah.
People kept wanting video games to have something awful in them. It just never happened.
I think there was also, yeah, like, so what do you know about the Satanic Panic, Chamomile?
Well, it mostly happened before I was born, so I mostly know of it through, historical osmosis and uh, the effect it had on my parents, because, of course, news news channels love to put out a story about how there is, a terrible satanic cult preying on your children, and they do not then like to, a few months later, put out the story that actually none of that ever happened, and we were taken in by some, frankly, shamefully inept con artists who nevertheless had us completely fooled.
All these moral panics end up being like made up by the media, like the Rainbow Party or that weird bird thing.
Right?
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the bird woman statue that was like allegedly part of some kind of weird suicide pact or something.
Yeah, it's always made up.
Cool looking
The Rainbow
statue, by the way.
Party,
Like that's a
the
fantastic
Rainbow
creepy
Party
costume.
thing, which I don't know if we can go into detail about what that was, but like, look it up and just think about yourself about how stupid that was that people believe that was a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have to go into detail about it just because I have to talk about how stupid this was. People actually believed that there were parties where the girls would wear different colors of lipstick in the seven colors of the rainbow, and the boys' goal was to get a blowjob from one girl of each color type so that their penis would have a rainbow on it. Only a teenager, and a young teenager at that, I mean like a 13, maybe 14-year-old, could possibly think that would work.
And yet, you say only a teenager could think that would work. And
true, and yet the teenagers are the ones who were not fooled. This is true. It's always made up. Anymore, do I?
So the Satanic Panic in the 80s into the early 90s, there started being a really... No, did that kill you in one hit?
Yep. It's fine, we're not that far off from where I was.
So the Satanic Panic... In the 80s up into the early to mid-90s, there's this idea of satanic crime and Satanism in media being a big problem, that there are organized groups of Satanists out there who are kidnapping children, who are committing all these horrible crimes, and they have influenced the media. They're being influenced by the media. Like, it's not always super clear which way the influence is supposed to run, whether it is... the Satanists of taking control of the media or putting satanic imagery in it, or the satanic imagery in the media is turning people into Satanists. It's not always super clear which is supposed to be going on in this made-up fantasy. We might end up having to put a warning on this entire episode, just because we are probably going to have to touch on the ritual abuse topic.
Yeah. Now, that's no big deal, though. I mean, I am definitely going to have to do a little bit of editing on Blasphemous in general. There are parts of this game that are not quite YouTube friendly. I mean, it's not even like, none of this game is like sexualized, but strictly speaking, the body parts do appear, so.
Right. One of the claims that happens during the Satanic Panic is what is called satanic ritual abuse. This is the idea that people, particularly children, were being abducted into these satanic cults and being subjected to ritual sexual abuse as a part of sort of a satanic ceremony. There were prosecutions. There were people went to jail, and
God damn.
In general, it had there was this huge effect on our culture. Like during second edition of Dungeons and Dragons, they switched from calling it demons and devils to Tanari and a word I have no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce it. Betsu or something. Atezu?
Gesundheit.
Because, and they also started calling angels Asimon and gods powers, because they wanted to move from any sort of religious context at all, because it was getting them targeted by the religious right.
Had no impact at all, by the way. Jack Chick continued alleging that, D&D was a front for Satanism well into the 90s, years after they had made these changes. Because, of course, attempting to appease these little petty bullies has exactly the opposite of the effect that you want. They aren't actually concerned about religious or satanic content appearing. They are looking for people who will react.
Yeah.
Best thing to do in this situation is always to just ignore them until they go away. Unless, of course, you can get away with just beating the shit out of them. But that is rarely the case, so.
So there's a lot going on in American culture leading up to this. People will sometimes try to point to one specific cause of the satanic panic. I don't think you can do that. This is a complicated social phenomenon where there's a lot of things going on at the same time that are influencing it. It's like when people talk about the witch trials, there's a lot going on that gets you to the point where witch trials are happening. It's like people will sometimes be like, oh, it's ergot poisoning. And first of all, ergot poisoning, the symptoms do not actually match what was being claimed by the witch victims. But also, second of all, even if it was ergot poisoning, you still have to ask yourself, all right, what is happening in a culture where if somebody has ergot poisoning, they are going to think it's a witch, and there's going to be legal means for them to accuse people of being a witch and get them killed. But also, it's not ergot poisoning. The symptoms don't match. So there's a lot going on in American culture leading up to this. First of all, censorship standards are being lowered in most media. The comic code will get abolished eventually. The Hays Code gets removed. You start seeing a lot of dark satanic imagery in movies. You start seeing like The Exorcist. You see hold on, let me get out my timeline. I have notes when I have a timeline that's separate, so it'll just take 1 second. Because some of the stuff I want to be able to point to exact dates of this happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I joke about being ludicrously overprepared for this, which you are, but like it's fantastic, so by all means.
So let me grab my notes. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Here we go.
You know, you're pulling up notes for a professionally researched discussion on the subject, and I'm just here playing video games, so this is working out great for me.
Yeah, so the Hays Code is abolished in 1968.
Hang on, you cut out for just a bit on the date. Do you want to say that again?
The Hays Code is abolished in 1968. The Hays Code was governed what you could have in movies. 1956 is the first, what is generally considered to be the first example of shock rock, is I Put a Spell on You by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Screamin' Jay Hawkins was a rock musician who would dress in sort of like he was a voodoo priest and sort of play that aspect up as part of his act. As we get into the 60s, you start seeing more imagery, like Rosemary's Baby. You start seeing horror as a genre really get its stride, like Night of the Living Dead. 1968, Black Sabbath is founded, and that's explicitly a satanic reference. It's also when In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida song is first released. That's generally considered the first metal song, heavy metal. The Church of Satan is established in 1966. When you get into the 70s, the comic code is repeatedly relaxed. I don't think it's actually abandoned until much later, but at this point it's essentially significantly less power, lots less restrictions on comics as a medium. The comics code had been established in the 50s. There was this fear of comics corrupting the youth into homosexuality and BDSM specifically, which, funnily enough, they weren't completely wrong about the BDSM, because Wonder Woman was originally a BDSM thing. So
I also find it kind of hilarious that they are specifically concerned about homosexuality and BDSM. Just because, given who the hosts of this specific podcast are.
They knew. They saw an image of the... But you get a lot of... You see the imagery, like 1973, The Exorcist, 1974, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's also when the term serial killer is actually coined, 1974. You also see the birth of the religious right as a movement. And so, chamomile, what was the original reason the religious right formed?
I am actually not certain, but I hope it's something dumb.
Well, I think most people will guess it's 1973 Roe versus, right? It's anti-abortion.
It definitely feels like it'd be one of their first major rallying points, but like I am too cynical to believe that something that sensible could possibly be the foundation for a political movement.
You were correct. And actually, it was pretty significantly after Roe versus Wade that evangelicals started turning against abortion as a concept. There was within a lot of evangelical groups, they were totally fine with abortion. The actual start of Roe versus Wade is actually opposition to desegregation. Not Roe versus Wade. The actual start of the religious right is opposition to desegregation.
Of course it is. It's always racism at the bottom of it, isn't it?
Yeah. The Supreme Court had ruled that, based on anti-discrimination laws, that you could not receive federal funding if you were segregated. So you had to accept black students. This is what coalesces the religious right. It even gets referenced by Ronald Reagan at one point. He sort of dog whistles it. He talks about the Supreme Court interfering with the rights of religious schools. He is specifically talking about the rights of religious schools to not admit black people. So...
This Bell Charge guy is completely glitched out, but I'll take it.
It is that leads to the formation of the religious right, not Roe versus Wade. But that happens, and this is when we start seeing the culture war happen. We start seeing, it's interesting, you actually start seeing the whole America is dominated by Satan pop up very early. John Todd is one of the early advocates of Satanic Panic being a thing. He starts his speaking career in 1968. Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. It's published in 1972. I forget when I don't have a punk called Rock when that is published. Let me see if I can look it up really close. Punk called Rock is the 80s. Yeah, so Satan is alive and well on planet Earth. Let me just pull up the description because this is going to loop back around. So, like, Satan is alive and well on planet Earth. Spiritualism, astrology, New Age religion, all of these are more are signs of the creeping influence of the father of lies on our time. 60s is when we start to see the not the end of cultural of hegemonic cultural Christianity, but we start to see the cracks form. We're seeing the idea that, like, people do not have to be Christian to be in American society. And it's just barely forming. Like, it's still, not only is America at this time overwhelmingly Christian, it is overwhelmingly Protestant Christian, but even that tiny little crack in the edifice gets a pretty big backlash from people who want America to be just Christian in every aspect.
Which, by the way, the idea that America is a traditionally Christian nation is, like, only true in the most extremely technical, you know, if you have a very broad definition of traditionally Christian sense of the word. America caring about religion is a recurring fad, not the bedrock of our society. We know it's a recurring fad because they're called Great Awakenings, and there have been exactly 4 of them. I say exactly. There's been 4 of them, except maybe only 3, depending on who you ask. The birth of the religious right in the 70s is, I think, clearly a 4th Great Awakening, but it is, there are people who disagree with that. I don't even know what their reasonings are, but they do exist, and so, you know, I shall do them the minimal courtesy of acknowledging their existence.
So all throughout the 70s, that's like when D&D is created in 1974. There's all this sort of much darker imagery and media, more satanic imagery. Though I will point out, it's really interesting to note that I'm not really sure, like, when you ever see the devil as a good guy in this media. Like, a lot of this media, even as it has satanic imagery, still has a Christian underpinning. The point of The Exorcist is not that, oh, actually, the devil's good. The Exorcist is about the triumph of the Catholic Church over the power of evil. And I kind of wonder if that's part of it, that, like, because a lot of this stuff it's Christian, but it's also very Catholic. And it's very Catholic in a country that at the time is still very Protestant. I think part of the reason that it's Catholic is, number one, our media tends to be centered out of LA, New York City, which are comparatively much more Catholic than the rest of the country. But there's also the fact that the Catholic Church is the oldest continuous human institution in the world. It's got a 2,000-year-old history, whereas the oldest Protestant church is going to have a 500-year-old history. There's a lot more, Catholicism is ancient.
Yeah, and it is unusual for a religion to persist that long as a single organized sect. I don't know of any other religion that has done that. Like, obviously, there are religions that predate Catholicism as a broad grouping, the way that Christianity is, right? Hinduism definitely does. Buddhism might, depending on exactly when you date the foundation of the Catholic Church, and also exactly when you date the founding of Buddhism. And there's a lot of, traditional sort of folk religions, Shinto, for example, Taoism, that have definitely been practiced for much, much longer. But none of these have had a continuous organization behind them, and which means that all of them have undergone constant schisms and reformations and recombinations. Like, the Catholic Church has a massive history as an organization, with a lineage of popes going back, in theory, all the way back to, what was it, Peter? I want to say Peter. One of the apostles.
Yeah, because Peter means rock, and Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church," which is part of where the Pope is supposed to have primacy, because Peter founds the church in Rome.
So yeah, the Catholic Church is, possibly the oldest human organization, period, right now.
There's also the fact that Protestantism strips away a lot of what makes Catholicism visually appealing and also sort of like weird and mystical, but it's really interesting for movies, since Protestantism isn't full on iconoclastic, but still gets rid of a lot of the imagery, the cross on a Protestant church usually does not have Jesus on the cross. It's usually the empty cross. You don't do a lot of statues or paintings, because that's idol worship. A lot of the ritual is de-emphasized.
You could not make a Protestant version of Blasphemous.
Yeah.
There's not enough Protestant iconography to make all the monsters and environments out of. You could definitely make a Protestant stage in a greater game like Blasphemous. There's enough iconography to have a Protestant church themed area, but that's it.
Yeah. So all throughout the 70s, we're seeing the cracks in the edifice of cultural Christianity. It's very small cracks, but they're still there. You're seeing this satanic imagery, even as the satanic imagery still tends to come on a very pro-Christian side. I'm not sure when the first example in popular media of the devil being definitively the good guy is. That's kind of an interesting question that I'm not certain about. Nowadays, you have a TV show where the devil is a generic CSI type investigator. But there would have been a time that Lucifer would have gotten that entire network boycotted. Probably would not have lasted a season. Like, it's amazing sometimes how much things have changed over a relatively short amount of time. So at the end, by the end of the 70s into the early 80s, that's when we really start to see this sort of backlash against this coalesce. The Satan Seller by Mike Warnke is published. Mike Warnke came to have been a priest in a Satanic church. He is what is called a confessing witch or a confessing Satanist. That's where somebody comes out and claims to have been a witch or a Satanist when they weren't, and like it's part of reinforcing the idea that there's this oppositional enemy to the hegemonic church, even though there actually isn't. And you see this even in when witch trials, people would be confessing witches. People would come forward and be like, "Yes, I was a witch," and but I've realized the light, or it was common. And this is another thing. I don't have this on my timeline, so I forgot to mention it. It's on my notes. You also have the rise of the Pentecostals, which I need to touch upon because it's kind of this interesting parallel that happens where charismatic Pentecostalists would. Are you familiar with what a charismatic Pentecostal would be, Camille?
I am vaguely familiar, but I don't necessarily know if our audience is even that much familiar. Like, there's probably, unless no one ends up watching this, there's going to be one person who doesn't know that, so you know.
Yeah.
At least.
So,
oh boy.
Charismatic Pentecostals had a lot of focus on, they were emerging in the 1900s. They had a focus on the idea of spiritual gifts, which is something that most Protestants de-emphasize. So like speaking in tongues, or like being able to ingest venom, or being bitten by snakes. I guess ingest poison. Being able to ingest poison or be bitten by venomous snakes and be unaffected, stuff like that. That's starting to come into its own.
Protestant churches, broadly speaking, believe that church should be boring.
Yes. They also did a lot of exorcism, which is, again, was something that had been de-emphasized in most Protestant churches. And the thing was, the line between speaking in tongues and being possessed by a demon to somebody who was not a member of this church but was still a Christian seemed very vague. So it was in the interest of the charismatic Pentecostals to really emphasize the difference and also to sort of like create an other that the accusations on them could be projected onto. So for the Pentecostals, this would be like witches or actual Satanists. Some of the reports from the Pentecostal churches would be about witches coming into the church meeting and having their power overwhelmed by God and then confessing to having been witches and converting to Christianity. The confessing witch that really just re-emphasizes the power of the church. And when you read some of these confessions, they really you can tell that it's not somebody who is actually not a Christian confessing. Like, it's like when somebody claims to be possessed by a demon, and they have this conversation with the demon's like, "Oh, I'm just so overwhelmed and terrified by the power of Jesus, please don't invoke his name." Like, this is not actually an opposition to this. It's not how a force opposed to the Christian God would actually act, simply because, like, how is this? What they're doing is not undermining Christianity, it's reinforcing it. Like, if somebody is possessed by a demon opposed to Christianity, it would try to undermine Christianity as much as possible, but it sort of undermines it in a fake way that reinforces it.
Right. Like, you know, even if you do have a weakness to holy names, why would you announce that? With exorcism and with speaking in tongues, there's a noted similarity to hypnotism, which was coming into its public prominence at the same time, as well as
as well as like using a Ouija board. There's a lot of stuff with suggestibility. When somebody's being exercised or speaking in tongues or having a past life regression, there's a lot of back and forth with the person in charge. They're essentially taking on a role, and they will act as the person in charge suggests and do what they suggest. So there's just a lot of back and forth. It's basically an altered state of suggestibility. All of these are this kind of like parallel things.
Yeah. Hypnotism, not so great for, discovering lost memories or whatever. It's, someone who has been successfully hypnotized is going to think, feel, or remember whatever the hypnotist wants them to.
So the Pentecostals have tried to sort of emphasize the idea of, we know we look like we're doing witchcraft, but actually we're not. There's some real witches who you should investigate. At the same time, you also have the rise of neo-pagans and Satanists, and they do the same thing. Like, Anton LaVey is like, oh, well, I don't do any evil work, but, like, there are people out there who do black magic. It actually hurts people. The same thing with the neo-pagans actually do this as well. Or like, oh, we just worship these beneficent gods and goddesses, but there are people out there who worship Satan and try to do harm to other people. One thing I want to mention is nobody is going to come out of this looking good. I have not found a single like organized group that was not involved in this and complicit in it in some way. Like, everybody looks bad. So that's how you have a lot of groups trying to deflect like sort of demonization of themselves. They go out and point, creating an imaginary other that they can point at and deflect blame onto.
Now, all these groups were, pointing towards some imaginary other, but like I like to imagine in the SNL skit version of this that it's a chain. Like there's the Pentecostals are like, what? No, we don't do witchcraft. The Wiccans do witchcraft. And then the Wiccans are like, what? No, we do good magic. It's, the LaVeyan Satanists who are worshipping Satan. And then the LaVeyans are like, what? No, we worship good Satan.
And one of the things about creating this other is that people will sometimes try to perform it. Specifically, like, you don't see any like organized people acting this way, but you do get what I call a hedge Satanist, which is usually like one or maybe a small group of like 3 or 4 people who are sort of adopting the pop culture accoutrements of Satanism as a way to be shocking, or sometimes as a way to because they find that they do want an excuse to do violence, and they've been told, oh, this is what people who want to do violence and evil do, and they're like, all right, then I'll just do that. There was one kid who did commit a murder, and he was involved with Satanism, but he did, when they interviewed him about it, he was like, well, I read the Satanic Bible, and I hated it because it said you're only supposed to hurt people if they hurt you, and I just wanted to hurt people for the sake of hurting people. So he was attracted to Satanism in his desire to hurt people, but actual LaVeyan Satanism did not actually offer the ideological justification for this that he wanted.
And I mean,
like,
you get this over and over again in the world where, once a narrative of evil has gotten going, it will pick up adherents who are simply literal antisocial psychopaths most of the time. But it never goes the other way around, right? Like, you never get a gang of psychopaths who become Satanists and then the media gets wind of it and breaks the story. It's always the media invents this narrative of Satanism as the ultimate evil, and a couple of psychopaths will hear that and think like, oh, that sounds cool, and try to like make it a thing.
Yeah, it's actually a noted phenomenon in folklore called ostension, where people will perform the folklore and essentially make it real. So the folklore is of the satanic groups is created, and then because this folklore exists in the cultural ether, people perform it. I think I'm getting the term ostension right. If there are any folklorists listening, be sure to write in.
And I was about to make a joke about how unlikely that is, but I think that might be our demo.
So you have, by the 80s is when this sort of like backlash actually goes mainstream, and it comes out of like the whole past life regression and hypnotism and recovered memories, which is very similar to past life regression and hypnotism. It's this whole performed altered state phenomenon of suggestibility. So in 1980, you get Michelle Remembers, which was published originally. Guess what magazines it was published in? A magazine and a newspaper.
I'm gonna say Mad Magazine and I can't remember the name of it, but like the white trash Martians Are Real magazine.
The magazine was People Magazine.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm being extremely optimistic about how much attention this got, how much prestige this was afforded in its original publication.
The newspaper was Maclean's, the Canadian newspaper. Michelle's Remembers was happened in Canada. I want to point out, Satanic Panic was not a purely American phenomenon. I've been talking about American culture, but it actually did happen across the Anglosphere and potentially in other countries. I don't want to say that it did not happen in other countries because I just don't know. I have not been able to find the sources on whether it did or not, and my foreign language skills are not good enough to like go in and see if like what is happening in France. But it did happen throughout the Anglosphere. So
this is the only historical era that I really consider myself had to have any kind of familiarity with is American history, because the primary sources are all in a language I can read.
Canada, the United States, England, Australia, New Zealand, Africa. I think I've seen occasional references to it in some other African countries, but I don't know how common it was. I don't know how common, for the most part, it was at all outside of the English-speaking world. But it did happen throughout the English-speaking world. I want to emphasize that. So Michelle Remembers is published. It's very clearly fake. Like, the devil himself pops up. But it gets mainstream attention. And at the same time, we get the suicide of James Egbert. James Egbert was in college and he killed himself. Now the thing about that, his mother blamed Dungeons and Dragons. Mazes and Monsters will go on to be the movie will go starring Tom Hanks actually will go on to be published sort of based on this. But the thing about James Egbert, there's a couple things going on with him. First of all, he is in college. How old is he?
He was like 16, wasn't he?
Yeah. He was a kind of scrawny 16-year-old. He was also gay in 1980. So this is not necessarily a great time to be gay. Like, we're post Stonewall, but it doesn't mean things are hunky-dory.
Like, by the 1980s, gay rights have become an issue.
Yeah.
Which means, it's something that's going to... More people are going to know and care about it as compared to eras when it was so far underground that, on the one hand, the police could give you shit about it with impunity. But on the other hand, a coworker was unlikely to notice or care.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, there will actually be constant attempts to, connect homosexuality and Satanism. There's this video I watched that was supposedly given to police officers. I haven't confirmed whether it ever actually reached a police department or not, but it was intended to be used by police departments. And this specialist in Satanism, who is a confessing Satanist, as we've talked about, so he was not ever a Satanist, Uh, anytime I mention a confessing Satanist, just append fake in front of that. Because they're always fake. Every single thing in this is going to be debunked by the end, like, spoiler alert. But he goes and, like, he's walking through this park, and he mentions illicit activities in the park, and he's like, sometimes that's homosexuals instead of Satanists, but then he goes like, then he says, oh, but a lot of times that's one and the same. So there's this connection attempting to being drawn between homosexuals and Satanists. So the case of James Egbert, he had been involved in Dungeons and Dragons, but he also had a lot going on in his life that you can see why this person would be led to suicide. He was apparently LARPing in like some underground stuff underneath the college, which, as Gary Gygax pointed out, I guess LARPing was not really a thing in Dungeons and Dragons at the time. He like, if he's doing it like in live action, that's not Dungeons and Dragons. But this is this, and you get Michelle Remembers, and you get the punk called Rock, which was criticizing. So I'm not positive about this. So there was definitely a time in American history when people, when somebody criticized rock music, what they meant was black music. The early criticisms of rock were heavily racialized, and this is a phenomenon that has happened a lot in American pop culture panics. It happened with jazz. It's later going to happen with rap. But I don't know whether by 1981, if when somebody said rock, if that was a dog whistle for black music. And a lot of the bands that get pointed out as being, almost most of the bands, I think, that get pointed out as being satanic are not black musicians. So I don't know whether this was this lingering fear of black music or whether it is something else by this point. One thing that has been noted with some of the early descriptions of satanic before the Satanic Panic is a lot of times they were very similar to indigenous religions. One of the early claims about one of the early people who goes in claiming there to be satanic cults, his description was very similar to British descriptions of indigenous Kenyan religion during the Mau Mau uprising. So I'm not sure whether the direction at rock music, whether this is code for racial panic over black music or not. But it is something I felt that is worth noting, because that has been a recurring theme in American pop culture panics. You even have, with jazz, you have the same sort of alleged satanic element. Like, it's not as prominent as it is during this panic, but you have the whole idea of, like, jazz musicians being inspired by the devil or selling their souls to get their music. But it is something that is worth noting, especially since we have talked about the fact that the religious rights origins are ultimately racial. In they were opposed to desegregation, but I'm not certain how clear the line is there. But the early 80s, that's when you're starting having the more mainstream backlash. Like, I mentioned some of the earlier stuff, like, and actually, as long as we're on the topic, like, I'll bring up the return of the Puritans, because again, like, there's a subtext to a lot of this stuff that is a lot more sinister than people realize. Like, the origin of this stuff is not nearly as just people concerned about devil worship as it seems. Like, a lot of it has a much more bigoted background. So when the earliest conspiracy theorists, when they were complaining about why were they upset with the Illuminati campaign? What did the Illuminati do?
I mean, the original Illuminati advocated for democracy.
All right, so in 1960, somebody's... But by 1960, somebody's complaining about the Illuminati. Surely they're not upset with democracy, right?
I mean, honestly, with how crazy conspiracy theorists get, I don't know.
They are. That's what the Return of the Puritans is about. She is upset that the Illuminati has turned America into a liberal democracy when it should just be a theocracy. And this is something that is recurring with conspiracy theories, the sort of, you dig deep enough and you'll find something pretty bigoted, like one of the foundational UFO conspiracy texts is Behold a Pale Horse, which, if you have the original edition, which I do, guess what it contains?
I mean, a reference to Jews somehow is usually a safe bet with these kinds of things.
Yes, the original edition contains the entire text of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, wow. Here I was thinking a reference to Jews, but no, just all of it. Okay.
Now, he does say that he's like, oh, well, when it says Jews, it's really just, it's the Illuminati, but I'm like, no, you don't get to do that. That's not how this works. But there's a lot of, like, implicit bigotry underlying that that you will run into if you dig deep enough into the Satanic Panic. Like, we've talked about the homophobia, the potential racism, the anti-Semitism, the sort of opposition to liberal democracy in general. It's everywhere. But it goes mainstream, and the mainstream versions tend to de-emphasize it. You still get into the thing where, like, ultimately, like, because people sometimes complain about devil worship. It's like, well, or like occultism, like that is not a secular issue. You cannot make laws against occultism, because that's just like a religious difference. Like, if somebody's worshiping the devil, you cannot do that a crime as its own. That's just a different religion, essentially. But it is treated as if it's something that, like, should be a concern of, like, secular people in general. I'm assuming we're approaching the end of the episode, so I don't know if I want to get into the actual Satanic Panic, which I basically set up, but we've not gotten to.
Yeah, let's go ahead and have that be our teaser for next time.